Chapter 20, Section 2 continued. The Spanish-American War had begun. Our Secretary of State, John Hay, is going to refer to this as a splendid little war. The country was ready to fight a war. The country was excited. People wanted this. But the United States was ill prepared for war. For example, our regular army numbered at 28,000 total. Now, our Navy was prepared because, if you remember from before, the Navy had already established a policy of being second to none. So they had already been building up. But the Army, they needed troops. They needed troops bad. 28,000 wasn't going to get it done. The United States is going to recognize Cuba's independence on April 20th, 1898. And Congress voted to use military force to help. But Congress also passes something called the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment stated that when Cuba won independence, the United States would leave the government and control of the island to itself. We weren't in this to gain a territory. We're to help them gain their independence, as we had from England in the American Revolution. The first battle of the Spanish-American War is going to be held in the Philippines, on the other side of the world. But this was a Spanish colony. Now, the planning for this war had actually started earlier than when we declared war. We actually backdated some of our movements to look like it happened after war was declared. For example, Roosevelt is going to cable orders to Commodore George Dewey that if the war were to begin, Dewey needs to attack the Philippines. The thing is, Dewey was stationed up by Japan. So he's going to move his fleet from up by Japan to Hong Kong. So we would be in position for this attack. On May 1st of 1898, Dewey's fleet is going to enter Manila Bay in the Philippines. The Spanish fleet sees us coming, panics, and they begin firing at us before we were even in range. It's going to take nothing for us to defeat this Spanish fleet in the Philippines. Spain still had wooden boats for a lot of their fleet, and we had these modern battleships. But what we have there is we have our Navy, and our Navy easily smashes Spain's fleet. But if you're going to take the Philippines from Spain, you're going to need ground forces. And that's where we come to Emilio Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo was a rebel leader in the Philippines. They had been fighting against the Spanish for 2 years, unsuccessfully. Well, now that we're there with our ships, Aguinaldo can take it from the land while we take the city from the sea. So working together, on August 14th, 1898, Spain surrenders in the Philippines. This war is going to be a little more difficult, though, in Cuba. Our army is going to be necessary in Cuba. We can't just do this from the sea. But the thing is, our army was woefully unprepared for this. As you see the picture there, there was our typical army uniform at the time. We're going to wear that in June or July to Cuba. It's going to be hot. There's no way we can do this. So down to as simple as our uniforms, all the way up to we needed new troops, and the new troops we did have, they needed training. July 1st, 1898, U.S. troops are going to attack the Spanish fort at Santiago. What we really wanted was the land above Santiago. It's always best to have the high ground, to be able to aim your gun down onto the Spanish fort, onto the Spanish troops. So the hills around these areas, El Caney, San Juan Hill, these are where we really wanted. Last we talked about Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, pushing for us to enter this war. We're in the war. We got what he wanted. Teddy Roosevelt does something that I can't see any politicians ever doing now. Teddy Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and is now Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. And he actually organizes together a cavalry unit called the Rough Riders. I mean, these were composed of college athletes, cowboys, Indians, ranchers. These were tough guys that could handle themselves. Teddy Roosevelt is going to lead his soldiers up these hills. He leads 1,000 soldiers up the hills. One thing you'll notice is missing in that picture there, it's a cavalry unit. There's no horses. They had been so excited to get there, they basically hijacked a ship to get down to Cuba to fight. Their horses were still waiting to come in Florida. We now control the ridges above Santiago. July 3rd, 1898, the U.S. Navy is going to sink the Spanish fleet in Cuba. We sink all the ships. The waters around Cuba were going to be ours. 2 weeks later, Spain surrenders in Cuba. The other place we have to fight is in Puerto Rico. Easily, we defeat the Spanish troops in Puerto Rico.